And so all these things go into mise-en-scène. The setting especially, the props that are used and shown, lighting, how lighting can impact the interpretation that we have of a particular scene, the acting, and that goes with the costumes, what people are wearing, to their makeup. There are a couple of images in your chapter about different makeup and how makeup can help us interpret a character. Dialogue, what a person says, what their accent is like, what their grammar is like. And you have to know grammar to get grammar jokes sometimes, but sometimes a character will be given bad grammar to make them seem maybe less educated or less caring about perfect grammar. As we've said before, nothing in cinema is by accident. Sound is also a part of mise-en-scène, although we have a separate chapter on sound. But we will say that sounds that you can hear produced on screen, that's part of the mise-en-scène, or the sounds that, when an object produces a sound and you hear it as you're seeing it, that's part of it. That's diegetic sound. Non-diegetic sound would be something like soundtrack music. And we've said before that soundtrack music definitely colors how we see a particular scene or character. I've mentioned a little bit before about the use of major key or minor key music. Major key music is very happy type music. Minor key music is often sad or scary. So if you're watching a scary movie, typically you're going to hear a lot of minor key music. If you're watching a Disney film, you're going to hear a lot of major key music, except in key points where there's tension in the story. Then you might hear some minor key music, some sad music. Bambi's mom gets shot, minor key music. But Bambi bounces back and has his own family and everything's going to be all right, major key music. The romantic setup where you have two people who fall in love, major key music. They have a fight and break up, minor key music. They get back together again, major key music. When we talk about mise-en-scène as a whole, the thing is that mise-en-scène really can shape how we understand a story. This involves colors. We can talk about archetypal colors here that are true across cultures. So different cultures have different meanings for different cultures, or different colors, sorry. But for instance, sunrise and sunset are typically associated with light colors and dark colors. So the light is a good thing in our human makeup. The sun's back up, the world is illuminated, so that makes the light good. Whereas when the sun goes down, the world turns dark. Not only that, but the sun goes out in the west, so that creates this mythos of the West being kind of an unknown, scary place where the sun disappears, prior to 500 years ago. And so that's why, for instance, the Great Pyramids of Giza, the Sphinx, if you know what that is the kind of like half man, half lion. He's facing east, so the sun comes up over him. So it's a very ancient cultural element. So as a result of that, light tends to be a good thing, dark tends to be associated with a bad thing. So when you have the Westerns, good guys wear the white hats, the bad guys wear the black hats. Star Wars, the good guys are in white, Darth Vader's wearing black, so forth and so on. Those are archetypal colors. Same with green, being used to associate with nature, natural things. Blue often can go two different ways. It can be a tranquil feeling or it can be a sad feeling. The color red is often used to indicate a character of passion or a moment of anger. These are also archetypal things. The bull with his, the bullfighter with the red cape or whatever to try and inflame the colorblind bull. But it's more for show than anything because it represents that whole concept of red. The locales that we see in our films are going to have a lot to do with how we interpret a particular story. Every film opens with a setting. That setting tells us a lot about what that film's going to be about. It might be a city, it might be a campus, it might be a natural environment, it might be space. It can be all kinds of different kinds of places. And as we look at these different settings, we're going to want to think about different props that are used as well. So as we go through all of this, you want to be able to define mise-en-scène as everything from setting to props, lighting, all aspects of actors and acting, and then of course, sound. And one thing that we started to talk about in Whale Rider, and that's the concept of space. Because you got to think of the frame is where all this composition is going to take place. And sometimes something is not in a space. I was talking with a student this morning, I don't see him here today, but we were talking about the concept of a horror movie having empty space. And that you know, if you know the horror movie form, that something's going to fill up that space. In addition to that, if you have a character who's extreme left or right of center, that character is going through some kind of turmoil. If we have, and we'll get to this in cinematography, if we have really small people in a huge expansive landscape, that is showing that those little people have a big journey ahead of them. It's showing the space. Well, if you look at some of the older films like Stagecoach, one of the early important westerns, all of the interior shots have real low ceilings, close walls, everybody's all jumbled up and together. It's kind of claustrophobic. And as soon as they get outside, it's Monument Valley. It's the giant West. And so the director, John Ford, on purpose, is showing that when people are indoors, it's all cramped out here in the West because we're just building the best little thing we can build to put everybody into. But when they get outside, it's this huge, expansive, open deal, and often people are shown as very small figures compared to that open space. And so you see that the journey or the quest or whatever challenge they have is going to be quite a large one. And so we want to look at space and how space works within various films. I have a couple tutorials I'd like for you to see, then we're going to see some special features, and then we're going to start watching a film. And of course, within the concept of props and characters and makeup are symbols. And so the symbols also become part of the mise-en-scène. Let's check out a couple of these tutorials. The first one, this setting and expressionism, this gets into the 1930s German cinema, because the Germans really established horror for us. And that is where I think early on I showed a couple of examples of Dr. Caligari and how the sets are all disjointed and have a lot of angles in them. And they're trying to replicate the psychological issues that Dr. Caligari is having. And we'll also look at lighting and then familiar image. That familiar image is that thing which continues recurring throughout the film to provide cinematic unity. So for example, we saw the angled beds in Whale Rider. With that, let's watch a couple of these.
When analyzing mise-en-scène, one element that is often taken for granted is the setting. It's too easy to think of setting as being designed and constructed simply to provide an authentic-looking backdrop in service of foreground action. Okay, sure, oftentimes that's just what it is. And that's fine, but setting is capable of much more. Like the other elements of cinematic language and mise-en-scène, setting can create mood, convey specific narrative information, elicit an emotional response, and communicate character state of mind. It all started with a German silent film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a movie that rejected verisimilitude in favor of expressionistic settings designed not to look realistic, whatever that means, but instead convey a particular perspective and mood. In this case, the somewhat deranged point of view of a narrator who is ultimately revealed to be mentally ill. Caligari didn't want to create the normal world for its audiences. It wanted to make them feel what its protagonist felt, seriously disturbed. It accomplished this in large part with its setting, which twisted the normally horizontal and vertical world of right angles into jagged, pointed diagonals. Now, Hollywood wasn't about to push things quite that far, but its filmmakers recognized the power of setting and incorporated the jagged diagonal stylization in films like The Bride of Frankenstein to make the audience feel uneasy in its unnatural world. But the filmmakers wanted to do more than just creep out the people watching. They wanted them to understand and empathize with the misunderstood monster. In this scene, the recently escaped monster is uncharacteristically happy, which the setting enforces and communicates with its lush pastoral detail. Of course, it's not long before somebody sees him and freaks out and everyone's trying to kill him again. So in the next scene, that same lovely forest is suddenly a barren, rocky stretch of stark, limbless trees. The location hasn't changed, but the monster's state of mind has, and so the setting design reinforces his feelings of rejection and fear. Anyway, let's jump ahead about 55 years to another misunderstood monster movie. Edward Scissorhands opens with pure setting that again rejects authenticity in favor of the expression of information, mood, and state of mind. This suburban neighborhood is all about bland conformity. No embellishments, no individuality, zero personality. And setting tells you that. Not dialogue, not performance, setting. And that's just the beginning. When the unsuccessful Avon lady starts looking for new customers, an even more expressionistic setting is revealed that's straight out of Caligari and Frankenstein. The jagged diagonals of Edward's lair don't just convey that the occupant is scary. It goes way beyond that. This is a place that's very different from the cookie-cutter neighborhood below. It's all about contrast. Where the suburb is about sameness, the castle is pure individuality. The inner yard setting communicates still more. Individuality, yes, but now the contrast is between scary and forbidding on the outside, innocent and exuberant on the inside. Setting is telling us all about Edward Scissorhands before we even see him. Inside the actual castle, the setting is now working the narrative. The otherness of the jagged edges and harsh diagonals, combined with the horror movie associations we have with such settings, thanks to Caligari and Frankenstein, among others, create a threatening mood that provides the tension that will be so effectively released when we finally meet Edward. The personal space a character occupies is often among a film's most effective character communicators, and Edward's room is no exception. That's not just a hole in the roof, that's the hole in Edward's wounded soul. His sad little manger bed conveys even more specific information about his desperate need for acceptance and belonging. The setting is so expressive of its occupant's background and condition that it only makes sense that it dominates the scene right up until the moment we finally meet Edward in person. An earlier movie, Night of the Hunter, also uses setting to evoke character state of mind. Whether it's a thick bank of fog expressing a naive victim's moment of ultimate delusion, or a bedroom shaped like a sinister church for a killer who sees the act of murder as a religious ritual. And just like the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, this film's expressionistic settings also have a more general point of view effect. But this stylized rejection of authenticity reflects not the point of view of a madman, but instead makes us witness the story's very grown-up events through the eyes of an innocent child. Even movies like Citizen Kane, that are much less blatantly stylized, use setting to set a tone and convey state of mind. For example, young Charlie Kane's idealism and vitality is emphasized when placed within these cramped, low-ceilinged sets. All that youthful energy practically bounces off the walls. But later, the emptiness of the jaded and alienated Kane's self-imposed exile is all the more striking when enacted in an absurdly oversized setting. I mean, that's what he gets for retiring to this creepy old castle. Wait a minute. That looks familiar.
Okay, we're just going to pop right along to the other two that are on here, and then we'll move on from there. Let's see if I think I can just get there that way. Okay, so this is a little bit about lighting. Lighting is one of the hardest things to deal with, especially when you're making films, but I think it's one of the most interesting things to learn to interpret when you're watching films.
Cinematographer Stanley Cortez's lighting in Charles Laughton's Night of the Hunter is more than beautiful. It effectively conveys character, narrative, and mood. The film also makes great use of what the film scholar Stefan Scharf called familiar image, which is the repetition of compositions, graphic elements, sound, or sequence to affect the audience's interpretation of a moment by allowing them to experience and understand it in the context of the similar shot from earlier in the film.
Okay, so what they're calling familiar image, we've talked about as the unity of cinema. These elements that recur in similar fashion, so they tie the whole film together.
Now, don't worry, it'll make more sense in a minute. We're going to look at a couple of scenes from the end of The Night of the Hunter that'll show you what I'm talking about in terms of both familiar image and the expressive and narrative power of lighting. But first, you'll need some sense of the story up until that point. Here goes. A desperate dad robs a bank and gives the money to his young son, John, making him promise not to tell anyone where he hid it. The dad gets caught and eventually executed, but not before the evil killer preacher man, Harry Powell, finds out about the hidden cash and shows up to seduce the kid's hopelessly dim-witted mother, Willa, who he kills the second he figures out she doesn't know where the money is, leaving John and his sister Pearl, who do know where the money is, at his mercy. They go on the run and are eventually taken in by a kind but tough old lady named Rachel, who already cares for a house full of orphans. Determined to find the stolen riches, Harry tracks them down. Okay, now for a shot-by-shot analysis of the scene where Harry comes after the kids and their hidden stash of cash. In this first shot, Harry boldly announces his dastardly presence by sitting in front of the house singing his favorite hymn. His backlit silhouette emphasizes his menace, just as similar silhouettes have many times before when he is at his most threatening. So his dark intentions are conveyed at this moment and reinforced by our associations with the lighting at all those other moments that came before. Familiar image and lighting. The next shot cuts upstairs to the sleeping children. Again, a familiar image evokes Harry's threat. This time, the lighting mimics the church-like composition of Harry's murder of John and Pearl's mother. The next shot cuts to Rachel standing guard with Harry still singing outside. Notice that Rachel is silhouetted with backlight, just like Harry 2 shots back. The backlight is equating her not with Harry's evil, but with his power. Her silhouette suggests that the old lady is just as tough as the killer outside. Now the scene cuts back upstairs, and the compositional association with Willa's murder is made even stronger now that young Ruby, a love-struck idiot just like Willa, is roused by Harry's crooning. In an earlier scene, Ruby fell for handsome Harry when she snuck into town, so the familiar composition linking Ruby's situation with Willa's fate makes the threat of Harry that much stronger. Cut to backlit Rachel. The camera tracks past her, linking her and her opponent in one fluid movement. Now Harry is no longer backlit. In this film, expressiveness is more important than continuity. Instead, the psycho-killer preacher is lit with a low-key side light, which uses illumination and shadow to divide his face into 2 distinct halves. This recalls many earlier instances where Harry's dual nature, 1 part scripture-quoting minister, 1 part homicidal maniac, is visualized with the same side light technique. So we understand Reverend Harry at this moment with those past events in mind. Familiar image. The next shot repeats the scene's first image of a backlit Harry waiting for the best moment to mount his attack. Again, the lighting pays no attention to continuity, preferring to communicate information, mood, and meaning. And in the upstairs window, light is used to draw our attention to Ruby heading downstairs, raising narrative expectations. What's going to happen when she gets mixed up in this showdown? When we cut back to Rachel, again, meaning trumps logic. No longer in silhouette, she is now lit so that we can not only see her saintly expression, but a halo of reflected light radiates from behind her head, adding to our interpretation of her as a shotgun-toting angel. The next shot doesn't exploit light much, but it's worth considering anyway. Harry is bigger in the frame, the largest he's appeared in the scene so far, raising his significance and foreshadowing his big move. And we clearly see his spatial position in relation to the screened porch where Rachel stands guard. Now to a reverse angle. Rachel's face is backlit again with her trusty 12 gauge ready for action in a revealing pool of light. Just beyond the end of the barrel sits side-lit Harry. The tension preceding their impending showdown is heightened by suddenly placing them together in the same shot for the first time in the scene. When Ruby enters the shot, light is used in a very unusual way. Whereas illumination is typically used to reveal information, this time it conceals Harry by reflecting off the screened window. Rachel blows out the candle, returning us to our original lighting scheme and revealing that Harry has slipped out of sight. Rachel stands into another halo and gently admonishes Ruby, who skedaddles back upstairs. A hoot outside draws Rachel's gaze, and the scene cuts to her implied point of view of an owl. Night of the Hunter loves to play with almost childlike symbolism, and here the owl stands in for the predatory Harry. Just to make sure we don't miss the point, the owl is side-lit in the same manner we've seen Harry many times before. Familiar image. The cute little bunny's fate is meant to give us very pessimistic expectations for the fate of the kitties snoozing peacefully upstairs. Okay, that's enough of this scene. I'll leave a few details for you to discover for yourself when you run out and rent Night of the Hunter. I'll just say that Harry ends up with a butt full of buckshot. Okay. The next scene doesn't have much to do with lighting, but it's a great example of familiar image. So the next morning, Harry's hiding out in the barn when the police arrive. He stumbles out waving his little knife and is taken into custody. The weird thing is that John, the kid that Harry's been trying to kill for half the movie, suddenly starts crying and calling Harry Dad and begging him to take the money back. The film uses familiar image to make sure that we understand that John hasn't suddenly developed an affection for Harry, but is instead reliving the traumatic event that started the whole mess and led to him losing both his parents. Compositions from the much earlier scene where John's father gives him the money and is arrested are repeated in this climactic scene. The cops arrive to arrest Dad. The cops arrive to arrest Harry. Dad wields gun. Harry wields knife. John reacts to Dad. John reacts to Harry. Cops grab Dad. Cops grab Harry. John cries out to Dad. John cries out to Harry. You get the idea.
Okay, so that's a good one. One more, I believe. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is composing the frame. This leads us into cinematography, which will be the next chapter when we get there. But for now, we're just going to check this out.
Settings, costumes, lighting, and figure movement, even acting and sound, all function as elements of mise-en-scène. But what really makes mise-en-scène work is how its visual elements are arranged or composed within each shot. So let's take a quick look at some composition guidelines and conventions. We'll start with the box within which all this visual information gets arranged. The frame used to be one consistent size and shape. Now it varies. And of course, the size and shape of your frame will have an impact on the arrangement of its visual elements. Composing for a square screen is different than composing for a wide screen rectangle. Which brings us to the whole idea of balance. As a rule, our minds, and by extension our eyes, seek equilibrium and order. On the movie screen, and in its less lively ancestors, the painting and the still photograph, that order takes the form of a balanced composition. The so-called rule of thirds breaks the frame into 3 vertical sections and 3 horizontal sections, resulting in a grid. This grid acts like a guide which artists use to balance visual elements in the frame. It's not an exact science. Art is never that simple. The basic idea is that composition is built in units of 3: top, middle, bottom, left, center, right, foreground, middle ground, and background. And often, for every visual element placed on one section, there will be some sort of corresponding element in the opposite section to counterbalance the composition. In this very balanced composition from Lawrence of Arabia, the visual weight of the well at the bottom of the frame is offset by the approaching figure, whose weight comes not from size and frame, but from its centered position, and its stark contrast against the band of sky dominating the top horizontal band, which is in itself in contrast with the muted browns of the rest of the frame. Adding to the top figure's significance are the implied eye lines and obvious attentions of the 2 characters balancing the wide-screen composition. And they'd better pay attention, because he's on his way to kill them for drinking his well water. The grid's top horizontal line allows for another very practical application. Cinematographers figured out a long time ago that by framing a character's eyes along this upper line, they could quickly and efficiently establish a practical and aesthetically pleasing placement of the face with just the right amount above of what is called headroom. Sometimes a story calls for composition that pushes the idea of balance to the next level, resulting in compositions that are so perfectly balanced that one side of the frame virtually mirrors the other. This symmetry can, depending on the context in which it's used, convey a sense of rigid order, strict control, or formal elegance, among other things. Sort of a super balanced frame, the ultimate application of the rule of thirds. Of course, rules are made to be broken, especially when it comes to the movies. By purposely breaking the rule of thirds and denying our expectation of balance, filmmakers can create what Bruce Maimer calls compositional stress. This imbalance can communicate all kinds of things, as always depending on the context in which it's used. A character is made to appear diminished or weak, or simply different. A moment is infused with tension, a premonition of something wrong. is planted. But sometimes what might appear to be imbalance is indirectly maintaining a different sort of balance. It all depends on what the subject is doing. Here, I'll explain. When a character is looking across to the screen, he's typically placed on one end of the frame so that his gaze is balanced with what is called eye room or looking room on the opposite side. The practicality of this method is proven by its standardization. How often do you see a shot framed like this? Same goes for walking. A character whose movement is covered with a tracking shot is invariably given lead room on the side of the frame toward which he or she is moving. Another application of apparent imbalance is something called negative space. We're so used to the rule of thirds that sometimes when we're presented with a lopsided composition, an expectation is created that something will arrive to restore balance. Here, negative space foreshadows the inevitable arrival of a man-eating alien. Same here, except now it's a hobbit-eating spider. Okay then, so far we've been dealing mainly with only two dimensions, height and width. Which makes sense since motion pictures may move, but they're still just two-dimensional images. But the world they depict features a third dimension, depth, and the movies use the appearance of depth in all kinds of aesthetic and narrative ways. Deep space composition emphasizes depth by placing significant visual and narrative information on two or more of the three planes of depth, foreground, middle ground, and background, in such a way that not only emphasizes depth, but also conveys information, mood, and meaning. This meaning can take many forms depending on how the levels of depth are presented. Relative size and frame position often tell us a lot. For example, this shot in Citizen Kane features characters empowered to decide young Charlie's fate large in the foreground, with Charlie's ineffectual father fluttering helplessly about in the middle ground, and the small, innocent, and powerless subject of their argument framed neatly in the background between them. Later in the film, the dissolution of a friendship is portrayed with the now powerful and power-hungry Kane looming in the foreground, his rejected confidant, Leland, much smaller in the middle ground, and poor, tiny Mr. Bernstein watching helplessly from the far background. The literal distance between them emphasizes their emotional distance. When Kane's wife Susan attempts suicide, deep space composition makes clear that pain-killing drugs influence Susan more than her distant husband. And Citizen Kane doesn't hold the monopoly on large foreground elements threatening smaller middle ground subjects. Poisoned coffee dwarfs its intended victim in this shot from Hitchcock's Notorious. And in Kubrick's The Shining, first the evidence of Jack's insanity dominates Wendy, then Jack himself steps into the foreground to do the same thing. Deep space composition is often referred to as deep focus composition, but that term can be misleading since it implies that all three planes of depth must be in focus. They often are, as with this shot from The Little Foxes. But this very scene demonstrates that visual elements need not be focused to still qualify as significant narrative information. In this scene, the invalid Horace has just denied his wife Regina the money she wants for a morally dubious investment. And so, in return, she's calmly detailing her long-standing contempt for him. First, this hurts his feelings, and then it sparks the beginnings of a heart attack, which just goes to prove that large foreground imagery doesn't always denote power. Sometimes its prominence simply conveys narrative significance. A bit later in the scene, he tries to jumpstart his failing heart, but drops the vital medication. When he asks his wife to hurry upstairs for the spare bottle, she weighs her options and decides that a fatal heart attack would free up the funds for her investment. Seeing that she's not going to budge, Horace has no choice but to try and get it himself. Okay, here's where deep space composition, but not deep focus, tells us a story. As Horace struggles from middle ground to background, he moves farther and farther out of focus. But that doesn't mean he's not significant. Instead, his increasing fuzziness communicates his rapidly fading grip on life, and his wife's effort to shut her husband's death out of her consciousness and her conscience.
You know, one of the unique things that's going on now in the film world is that we sometimes call DVD extras film school in a box, because there's so much that can be learned from just checking out all the extras. So for example, this DVD of True Grit has a whole section on the costuming of the characters and what went into it in trying to recreate the proper clothing, but to show that the clothing goes with character traits, and it's all done very strategically so that the costuming that the characters are wearing tells you things about them.
When I started doing the research on this movie, you know, you're vaguely familiar with this time period, but then you have to refresh yourself. And I did a lot of research. I did it for at least a month, month and a half. And what I noticed was that the women all had long hair, and the men all had facial hair. A lot of the men's clothes were in the charcoal gray family, and the brown family, and the black family, and their shirts were white or sometimes a textured stripe. And so we sort of based the color palette on that, because the women's clothing did come in lots of different colors, but for some reason it just didn't seem right for the story we were telling. And even if people were farmers, it's what they come to town wearing, particularly the gallows scene. It's their best outfit. It's 1870, and it's right when the bustle happened. It was actually a very short-lived phenomenon, and I love the idea of the hoop skirt. And so the majority of the women have a hoop skirt on, and I just wanted that dome shape to be sort of moving around the town, and I wanted to use some small prints on those dresses, or checks or plaids, but muted, but it would to animate the crowd because the men were going to be in such dark colors. We also wanted to make it urban in a way because we wanted it to differentiate. Stetson was a dress hat company in Philadelphia. His son had asthma, and he went west. And he sort of started to see these cowboys and saw that they needed a hat for droving. And so he said, I think these guys need a hat with a wider brim. And he went back and he had his dad make them, and it was called the Boss of the Plains. And it's got a 4-inch brim and a 4-inch crown. And that's sort of the cowboy hat of this time period. It's not, you know, what you would normally think of as the quintessential cowboy hat.
One of the most important aspects of developing a character for me is the wardrobe, and that tells you all kinds of things about the character. So as far as the costumes go, I'd work with Mary Zofries, and I sure admire her expertise on the, you know, the looks that we were, you know, going for, and she gave me all kinds of wonderful books to look at all the different styles that the guy might wear, and we worked together for, you know, a few days, figuring out you know, the right hat for the guy, the right patch, you know, for the eye. Boots are always important.
He's one of my favorite costumes. I couldn't find a coat for him anywhere, and Celeste Cleveland, who's my cutter, had started that Monday. We were fitting Jeff, I think, on Friday. I was like, I can't find a coat, and she like made one for me without really any measurements of him, and we had some measurements of him from another movie, and like the minute he put that coat on, we were like, done, that's Rooster. It was like, that was so, like, and it has a big slit up the back, so when he gets on his horse, it kind of, you know.
I'll stand hill for you as soon as I can. Don't wander off.
But it's not too grandiose, like, and it's really, really aged. He has a cutaway underneath it. We have him wear his holster underneath his gut because Jeff really doesn't have a gut, but he kind of thrusts it out when he's Rooster. He has a shirt, he has a vest, he has his coat, so it makes him look a little bit bulkier. Maddie's costume is, the idea is that she's come to town, she thinks she's going to take care of her business in about a day. She figures she'd go home in the same dress. She has one dress, her one going to town dress. And it's a feminine dress. She doesn't wear a hoop. She has petticoats underneath. When she decides to go on the trail, what she ends up doing is she takes her dad's pants, she takes her dad's overcoat, she uses her own coat that she's worn to town, and her dad's hat, and she puts those on with the same boots that she came to the town with. That's what she goes on the trail with. And she takes a belt off of her dad's saddle, and that's what she hoists it all together with. LaBeef is in buckskin. Nobody else in town wears buckskin. He's the only one for miles in buckskin. And so that was on purpose because we wanted him to sort of stand out as, it's described in the script as someone with maybe a little too much panache.
This was a character who had a lot of flair, you know, from the buckskin jacket to the guns and the spurs and everything. It's tough to be taken seriously in a buckskin jacket, so that was kind of a fun, you know, play a bit of a dandy.
His facial hair is a little bit more sculpted and groomed, and he's got fringe on his buckskin. And LaBeef's hat has a fancier hat, and his has a wider brim because he's from Texas and very close to Mexico, so it could have come from there. and he's taken the time to give his hat a certain blocking. You know, it's got a curve on the side and it kind of goes over his eye. And again, it's like the buckskin coat. It's got maybe a little bit too much panache. It's scripted, and it's also in the book that Lucky Ned wears woolly chaps.
These were such a unique item because, you know, we really hadn't seen that in Westerns, I think, since maybe Tom Mix. So they needed to be very specific. They needed to look lived in and well worn. And they were huge. They were big and white and woolly. And I was a little bit nervous that I was going to be wearing these monstrous big woolly white chaps. But she said, no, don't worry. These are going to get all dressed down and very much in the Coen Brothers sort of style of washing things out and really kind of as realistic as possible.
Woolly chaps are things that they're chaps made out of Angora. The front of them is made out of Angora, the back is leather. It was for rain, mostly. If the chaps got wet, it would repel the water, just like on an animal. We had to have them made for him, and it was a really, really difficult job to age them. I had the most outstanding aging department on this movie. It was all about the aging, and particularly the characters that are on the trail. Josh Brolin's meant to look like an animal. He should just look like a hairy animal. A lot of it was his facial hair and like he got teeth but you know, he's in a cutaway. It's sort of like as if he stole it from somebody. Like it's a little bit too small in the chest and a little bit too short in the length, but my thought was that he stole it off of somebody he killed. Having a great fitting with an actor and then watching all the elements come together when there's a big scene, and you know, the palette things you've talked about and all the alterations. Like, I'm a bit obsessive, and I do, like, even with all the principles and with all the background, it's like you're painting a painting with each person, and when you put all of those people together, it becomes an even bigger composition. And when they come to set, it's like harmony for me. It's like if it could be a sound effect, it would be voices just like, oh, you know, and that's how I get goosebumps every time. It all comes together and it looks how you want it to look, and it just comes from being collaborators, and that's how Joel and Ethan run their set. I think I love doing what I do because I work for them. Everybody talks to one another. It's how it should be. You know, it's a real collaboration.
Okay, so let's go to the recreating the town, talking about setting.
In the course of figuring out how to shoot the movie, we happened to find a town here in where we're sitting right now in Granger, Texas. This was a railroad town back at the kind of the turn of the century, and some of these buildings are a little bit later than 1878. We managed to come in and try and bring things back another 25, 30 years.
In this particular location, we're recreating Fort Smith 1875.
We were fortunate because there's a lot of existing reference material on Fort Smith, Arkansas, and then there's just a lot of reference on towns of the time. One of the challenges is most of that reference is all black and white. So for us doing a color film, we want to make sure that we're doing something that plays into the time period, but also the look that we're trying to achieve. We spent a long time referencing colors that would be appropriate for the period.
The main thing that was important was to have a nice wide street. They had wide streets in those days so they could turn the wagons around. That's one of the things that when they settled on building on both sides of the streets, all the streets were wide. This happened to have that. It was cobblestone, which you see we had to put dirt down on, which we just did, and we're dealing with the rain, and it's muddy, it dries out, it's muddy, so it's starting to get packed down pretty nicely. And actually, I think it came out pretty damn good.
It's been about 3 to 4 months since we started. We've had lots of carpenters and scenics and greensmen. We've built facades over a lot of these buildings. We've built into some of the buildings. We've raised awnings. Making it winter is something we started in. In fact, one day it snowed when we were here, which is an uncommon occurrence in Granger. It was a nice way to see what it will look like when we add our snow to it.
I'll tell you what was here was 1, 2, 3. Those brick buildings, they were just flat. But the tops of them are really quite interesting. And the thing about what I'm trying to do with this Western, different from other ones, is to make it, you know, post-Civil War, not a coal mining town, no swinging saloon doors, you know. It needs to be America on the uprise and have some substantial buildings. And I think all these smaller cities like Fort Smith, Arkansas were trying to copy Chicago or New York. And this was the last stop on the train. You know, after this, you went into the wilderness. We obviously...
Okay, just for our point of view there, the last stop is Fort Smith, and then you go into the wilderness. What's the wilderness? Oklahoma. Fort Smith's on the border of Arkansas and Indian Territory. So what they're saying there is like, when you left Fort Smith, you were in the wilderness, which was then Indian Territory. So I just bring that up for historical reference.
We couldn't do blocks and blocks of the town, so it was all about embellishing this block and that side street and carefully shoot it to, you know, make it look bigger than it is. You can see that once again, it's got really interesting shapes on top of the building, which I love. From where that yellow wood building starts to the end, there's an existing post office behind the saloon, which we have to deal with every day, rightfully so. People coming to get their mail and driving in, and so it's a little bit of a hardship for us, but mainly probably more of a hardship for them. That's, you know, the whole town. That's our stable of carts and wagons, which all have horses connected to them and make this street come alive. This tall, skinny building over here, this was not here. The street sort of ended there, and there was a big void in here, as you can see. The sidewalk continued across. We chiseled it out just to make it, you know, seamless into the town.
Nothing is real punchy in color. There's no bright reds or bright blues. We've stayed in things that are greens and off-whites and kind of keeps that sepia feel to things.
This was another sort of cornerstone for wanting to shoot in this town. It's a period bank. It's a little bit, it's probably like 1905 or 6, so it's a little bit ahead of our time, but
I got it.
We turned it back with some awnings and changed the signage around and put some plugs in the doors and things, and it fits in. It right steps this town up a little bit from just the wooden facades. I love this building and how it fits in. This is the area we selected to shoot this gallows scene, which in the movie it's supposed to be winter, so we've been taking the leaves off of trees manually. That took a couple of people about, you know, a week on a cherry picker just to pick off the leaves. So whatever trees are in the shot, we're trying to, you know, make it look like winter. And that's just a great tree because we're going to have this big, you know, the big hanging scene, and there's going to be, I don't know how many, maybe a couple of hundred extras. And we're going to put some people up on that roof line up there watching, which is, I think it's going to be cool. It's just going to let the characters and the costumes take this scene over against that blank wall over there. I think it should be pretty good. So this is the boarding house in the movie, which is a facade, fake facade that we stuck in here, and these talented painters are aging it right now. Even though it's probably fairly new in the movie, it's just, we need to age everything down so it looks good on film. No fresh paint job ever looks good on a movie, especially for a Western, even though it's probably supposed to be new. And this street is the main shot. One of the main shots is down here. There was probably 6 telephone poles on either side with telephone lines and power lines running through them, which we had removed just so we could have this shot. There was a couple that were too expensive to take out, like this one, so we wrapped it in tree bark, and when you see it from this direction, it should appear to be a tree. This angle right here happens 4 times in the movie. So to achieve that, we had to build another little house here, and 2 facades deep in the background that have those chimney stacks on them, and then a real visual effect will just funnel into nothing over there. You could probably come around the back of this and see what's going on in some of the backs of the houses. So this is the back of this facade, and we do have a couple of shots looking out the front door. We have an interior that matches this down the block, which is the whole scene inside the boarding house.
Getting in the mindset of 1875 is challenging, and stopping and looking and see what things will tell a viewer that you're not in 1875, to really remind yourself there was no plywood. There was a lot of different things that we take for granted that we see all the time now weren't there. So really keeping focus on that has been hard, but exciting too. It's fun to remember what it may have been like.
It's really the first introduction to the town where Maddie and a hand from the farm where she lives, they arrive in the town and they're going to retrieve the body of her father, and they arrive by steam train. And so we had a train, we had to get a hold of this period steam train that we brought in specially and made arrangements with the Union Pacific, who has the rail line that's here in Granger.
Okay, now back to costuming and character movement. So we've got these figures moving on the ground here.
The creatures were extremely malnourished. They were very unhealthy. They seemed to be...
So he's a government guy, so of course we got him in a cinder block room. Just kind of a generic, stale, antiseptic room.
Aimless. There was a lot of international pressure on us at the time. The entire world was looking at Johannesburg, so we had to do the right thing. The government then established an aid group that started to ferry the aliens to a temporary camp that was set up just beneath the ship.
Okay, so now we get a shot of what looks like just everyday, well-intentioned workers. Looks like that might be North Lake, maybe that's a Christian school of some type. But just the idea that, hey, these people are from another planet, they're here, we're not people, whatever they are, they're here, they're hungry, so we need to get them some stuff.
We didn't
And then we see the characters themselves.
have a plan.
Of course, they don't move like humans.
There was a
They
million
look very different.
So what was a
And that would be a point of view shot of one of the aliens, what come to be called the prawns, because they look kind of like shrimp, I guess.
temporary holding zone soon became fenced, became militarized, and before we knew it, it was a slum.
Well, the truth is, no.
Okay, so more mise en scène, some graffiti back here. They said it's a slum. This is what I guess they eat. So this guy's chopping it up. Looks like some kind of horse head
Nobody
or
really
something.
knew what this place was. There's a lot of secrets.
Okay, now how about this guy? He's an engineer, so what do you put behind him? Of course, his drafting table, because that's going to signify that he's an engineer that draws plans and so forth.
It's in District 9.
Now the title frame, which is all important. If there's images behind it, sometimes you might just see the black screen with the title. The film is called District 9, and of course that's telling you this is District 9. This is the slum area, so you have a fence that you can see the shadows of over here. You can see the little guard tower on this side, and then it just continues on over here. So this mise en scène tells you that this is a very crowded place and probably not very sanitary. And as the shot widens,
at first a lot.
Okay, so you see how big it is. Next, aid worker. She has her badge on, something that kind of looks like a medical scrub. She's in some sort of maybe a medical type place. So when we have a character who's supposed to represent a certain occupation, we not only dress them in a certain way, but we place them in a context that indicates further elements of their profession.
The attention was given
All these are
to,
aspects of mise en
giving
scène.
the aliens proper status
Setting.
and protection.
Costume.
They're spending so much money to keep them here when they could be spending it on other things.
Now you have a close-up of who's just maybe a common person in maybe a grocery store or something.
But at least they keep it.
Now again, that real bouncy handheld camera. See, now you're starting to see signs that say, no, not welcome. So the prawns are not welcome. So they're setting up this idea that they are not part of the rest of society and they're not supposed to go into shops and things. And those people who remember things like the Civil Rights era or the way in which people of non-white ethnicities have been treated in the United States, this resonates with that. Hey, these people are not like us. So with that, we'll see you guys after I get back from Nashville. See ya.